He thought I wouldn't notice. But when I woke up to the silence, everything changed. $200,000 gone, transferred to an account I didn't know existed. He didn't just betray me emotionally. He was playing a much bigger game. But I wasn't going to let him win. Lyra woke up in the middle of the night, a strange stillness filling the room. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the fog of sleep, but something felt off. Her husband, Callen, was not in bed. His side of the sheets were flat, not even a hint of warmth left behind. She instinctively reached out, expecting to find him there, but only encountered the cold, empty space. The silence was suffocating, thick with tension, and it didn't feel like the kind of quiet that came with peaceful slumber. No, this was something else. A flicker of worry crossed her mind. Maybe he had just gotten up to grab a glass of water or had trouble sleeping. But even as she told herself that, a gnawing suspicion took root. She strained her ears to listen, but the apartment was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Then, just as she was about to lay back down, she heard it, his voice. Quiet, careful. Almost too calm. It's done. She'll never find out. Lyra's breath caught in her chest, her heart racing. She froze, her body rigid as she processed what she had just heard. Her mind scrambled, trying to make sense of the words, but nothing seemed to fit. What did he mean? Who was he talking about? Her pulse thundered in her ears, and for a long moment, she just lay there, barely breathing, trying to stay as still as possible. He laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill down her spine. The clink of glass followed by the sound of footsteps moving away. He was coming back. Lyra's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Every part of her screamed to get up, to confront him, to demand answers. But the fear of what she might find, held her down. Instead, she remained motionless, eyes wide in the dark, listening. Her instincts screamed at her to act, to do something, but she forced herself to stay still. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she kept her breathing steady, as if she could somehow fool him into thinking she was still asleep. When the door creaked open, she pretended to shift in bed, pulling the covers tighter around her. He stepped into the room, and she could hear his footsteps approaching. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, pretending to stir from sleep. "Bathroom," he replied, his voice too casual, too smooth. "And the call?" "East Coast stuff, you know how it is." Lyra didn't push further. She let the silence stretch between them, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Callen kissed her forehead, as if everything were normal, as if nothing had changed. But it had. And she knew it. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that something far worse was brewing beneath the surface. When morning came, Lyra didn't sleep. Her mind wouldn't let her. She could barely think straight as she slipped out of bed and padded quietly to the kitchen. Her phone was on the charger, and she hadn't checked their joint account in months. That had always been Callen's job, his financial hat, as he liked to call it. But today, something inside her refused to stay blind any longer. She logged in, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed in the password. Her eyes widened as the screen loaded, revealing a transfer of $200,000 to an account she had never heard of before, Callen Enterprises. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't a client, it wasn't a vendor, and it wasn't anything they had ever discussed. For a moment, she just stared at the screen, disbelieving. She refreshed the page, hoping that maybe it was a mistake. But the numbers didn't change. The money was gone. Her pulse quickened as she sprang into action. She snapped out of her fog, opened her private cloud, and started uploading screenshots, transaction details, everything she could find that might help her in the future. Triple encrypted, sent to a backup email only she knew. No one else could access it, not even Callen. But she didn't confront him. Not yet. Not now. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment betrayal. This was calculated, premeditated. And Lyra had been a strategist for 15 years. She knew exactly what to do next. At 6:48 a.m., she called the bank. By 7:15, the account was frozen. Her mind raced, her thoughts a blur as she stared out the kitchen window, watching the city wake up. The light filtered through the glass buildings downtown, but inside her apartment, everything felt frozen in time. Callen had no idea that the battle had already begun. She hadn't said a word to him, but she didn't need to. She wasn't afraid anymore. Lyra had made her move, and there was no turning back now. As the day passed, she couldn't help but think back to the previous night, to the coldness in his voice, to the way everything had shifted. The more she thought about it, the more it became clear. She wasn't just dealing with a betrayal. She was up against something far bigger. And she wasn't going to let him win. The question was, how long had he been planning this? How much more was there to uncover? Her mind raced ahead, already thinking of the next move. But one thing was certain, Lyra wasn't going to wait for the truth to come to light. She was going to make sure it did. And so, with the first light of morning creeping through the blinds, she made her decision. This wasn't just about saving herself, it was about reclaiming everything she had lost. Lyra sat silently at the kitchen counter, her phone gripped in her hands. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting thin stripes of sunlight across the polished surface. Her heart was pounding, not from exhaustion, she hadn't slept a wink, but from the chilling realization of what she had just uncovered. The screen in front of her had shown nothing but an eerie emptiness, a $200,000 transfer gone, sent to an account she had never heard of. But it was more than that. It was the moment that everything changed. She had always trusted him. Callen. They had built a life together, or so she thought. They had shared their finances, their plans for the future, and yet, as she sat there now, the truth was staring her in the face, he had been lying to her all along. The money wasn't just misplaced or a mistake. It wasn't a sudden, impulsive decision. It had been carefully planned. Every detail had been calculated. She wasn't just a victim of infidelity. She was caught in the middle of a well-orchestrated scheme. Her mind, usually calm and calculating, went into overdrive. As a professional strategist, she knew the importance of swift and decisive action. She couldn't afford to let this slip through her fingers. This wasn't just about saving their marriage, it was about protecting herself and making sure that Callen didn't get away with what he had done. The betrayal was personal, but the stakes were bigger now. It was a matter of securing her future. The moment the transfer had been confirmed, Lyra knew what she had to do. The account had to be frozen, and it had to be done before Callen even realized she was onto him. The bank would be her first stop. But she couldn't just stop there. She needed evidence. Solid proof that what Callen had done wasn't just a one-time mistake, it was part of a larger plan to strip her of everything. She wasn't going to let him take what was hers. She moved with purpose, logging into their joint account with steady fingers. It felt like a strange betrayal of its own. This account had always been their shared space, where both of them managed their finances, paid bills, and discussed their future. But now, it felt like a fortress, and she was the only one who could protect it. The transfer was glaring in front of her eyes. $200,000. The recipient, Callen Enterprises. She didn't recognize the name, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it was a name she shouldn't know. It wasn't a business they had ever discussed, no contract, no invoices. There was nothing in the history of their relationship that even hinted at this account, let alone the money that had vanished into it. She was filled with a mix of dread and determination. Her fingers hovered over the screen, feeling the weight of the decision. What would Callen do if he found out? Would he try to cover his tracks? Would he try to make this all go away? She couldn't wait to find out. She had to act first. With the same calm demeanor that had helped her in business for years, she began the process of securing the evidence. She took screenshots of the transaction, capturing every detail, the time, the amount, the recipient. She uploaded everything to her private cloud, triple encrypted it, and sent it to a backup email address that only she had access to. It was a safeguard, an insurance policy. She didn't trust anyone, not even him, at this point. Not anymore. As the minutes ticked by, her pulse slowed, but the tension remained. There was no turning back. She couldn't confront him just yet, not when she didn't have all the pieces. But she knew that the second she told him what she knew, there would be no hiding the truth. It would all come to a head, and she needed to be prepared. The clock was ticking, and she knew that time was one thing she couldn't afford to waste. Her instincts told her that the first step had to be the bank. She made the call at 6:48 a.m. and by 7:15, the account was frozen. She had done it. The first step in her plan had worked. But she couldn't just rest on that success. Lyra was playing a long game now. She had the proof she needed, but what would come next? What other lies had Callen told her, and how deep did they go? How long had he been planning this, and how far was he willing to go to get what he wanted? She had to be careful. Callen was not just a man she had trusted, he was a man who could destroy her if given the chance. The morning unfolded with an eerie calm. The light in the city outside was soft, but Lyra couldn't shake the cold feeling in her chest. She stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the buildings that seemed so distant now, as if they no longer held any meaning for her. Callen, for all his charm and ease, was not the man she had once thought he was. And with that thought came a sharp clarity, she was done playing his game. But she couldn't help but wonder, what was his next move going to be? How would he react when he found out that his carefully laid plans had already been upended? She didn't know, but she was ready for whatever was coming next. As she waited for him to wake up, Lyra's mind raced. She didn't know how long he had been plotting, how far his reach had extended, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going to be his pawn any longer. She was going to fight back. And this time, she wasn't going to lose. Her eyes flicked to the pile of papers on the counter, and she saw it. A form, buried among the other mail. It was an asset declaration sheet, and her name was already filled in at the top. Callen had made the mistake of leaving it there, right under her nose, as if it were just another document to sign. But Lyra wasn't going to be fooled again. This was no innocent mistake. It was another calculated move in a much larger scheme. As she picked up the paper, she felt the weight of it in her hands. It was a clear sign that Callen had been thinking about this for a long time. He had been planning every step, anticipating every move. But what he didn't count on was her. What he didn't count on was Lyra's mind, sharp, analytical, and now more determined than ever. She set the paper down, her hands steady. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. And she would make sure that, in the end, Callen would be the one who lost. Lyra sat in the dimly lit study, her fingers trembling slightly as she clicked through the files on her laptop. She had been staring at them for hours now, but the truth still felt like a cold fist tightening around her chest. The digital copies of the documents he had slipped into their financial records were impossible to ignore. They weren't just tax forms or investment updates. They were lies, crafted with a skillful hand designed to hide the truth from her. The first document she found had been subtle, an invoice from a company called Haven Industries, one she had never heard of, never seen, and certainly hadn't approved of. The amount on the invoice was substantial, a figure that seemed out of place with their finances, but it was only the beginning. As she scrolled through the next few files, each one grew more elaborate, more calculated. There were fake bank statements, doctored signatures, and fraudulent transfers that went back months, even years. It was as if Callen had built an entire parallel financial world without her ever suspecting. Her eyes narrowed, and a bitter laugh escaped her lips. He had planned this for a long time, hadn't he? The careful manipulation of their joint accounts, the creation of false transactions, all with the purpose of setting her up to fail. But what hurt more than the documents themselves was the realization of how deep the betrayal went. He hadn't just been playing her for a fool. He was playing a game, one where she was the pawn, and he was making the moves from the very start. Lyra's mind raced, piecing together fragments of her past life with Callen. The late nights, the subtle shifts in their relationship, The odd questions he had asked about her financial security, the sudden push for them to consolidate all their assets, and now this planned deception. He had been preparing for this moment, perhaps even before they married. But why? The whispers from the past started to haunt her. The suspicious phone calls he had taken late at night, the weird texts he had tried to hide, and the odd behavior when she asked about their future. How long had he been building this scheme? Months? Years? The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This was no random act of betrayal, it was an entire life crafted behind her back, a life she wasn't even allowed to see. Her pulse quickened as she snapped out of her reverie. No. She couldn't keep focusing on the past, on the lies he had built. She had to act now. Lyra had always been a strategist, and she would play this game with a mind sharper than any of Callen's devious plots. The first thing she needed to do was secure the evidence. He would never expect her to have already discovered the depths of his plan. She knew the next step was clear: freeze the assets. Every joint account they had, every property in both of their names, every asset they shared. She needed to act swiftly before Callen could try to hide any more of his tracks. At 6:48 a.m., she picked up the phone and called the bank, making sure to lock down everything that had once belonged to both of them. By 7:15, the accounts were frozen, and she knew, without a doubt, that her actions had caught him off guard. But what she hadn't anticipated was how much of a toll this was taking on her emotionally. Lyra had spent years building a life with Callen, and the strain of keeping this secret from him, the constant pretending, the smiles, the small talk, was starting to wear her down. The house felt like a stage, and she was the sole performer, playing her part in a drama that had already been written without her knowledge. Callen had always been a master of manipulation. His charm was disarming, his competence intoxicating. He had made her believe in their future, in their life together. But now, Lyra was beginning to understand the true nature of his deception. The fake documents were just the beginning. What she hadn't realized until now was how deeply he had worked to control her, emotionally, financially, and even mentally. His latest attempt to control her had been through a series of anonymous threats that had started appearing in her inbox. At first, they seemed like just random spam, threats of ruin and scandal if she ever attempted to expose the truth. But with every message, with every vague but threatening word, Lyra began to piece together his final moves. He was trying to scare her into submission, trying to make her believe that if she didn't go along with his plans, everything would fall apart. What Callen didn't realize, though, was that he had underestimated her. She wasn't the woman who had blindly trusted him. She wasn't the woman who had believed in every sweet word he'd whispered to her over the years. No, she was something else now. She was the woman who had uncovered his lies, and now, she was the one in control. Despite the cold fear gnawing at her insides, Lyra couldn't help but feel a surge of strength. The more she uncovered, the more she knew that she was right to act quickly. Callen had built this house of cards, but it was about to come crashing down. What hurt wasn't just the betrayal, it was the realization that everything he had told her, every intimate moment, every promise, was part of his grand deception. He had been plotting for far too long, and now, the game was on. As the morning sunlight crept through the blinds, Lyra sat back, eyes fixed on the papers in front of her. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The truth was out, and now she would make sure that Callen would pay for his lies. There would be no more secrets, no more pretending. She had her evidence, her strategy, and most importantly, she had the strength to see this through. But as she prepared to move forward with the next step in her plan, a part of her couldn't help but wonder, would Callen ever realize what had truly happened? Would he understand the extent of the woman he had just underestimated? In the quiet of her thoughts, Lyra knew one thing for certain: this fight wasn't over yet. Lyra's heart raced as she entered the small, inconspicuous office of her lawyer, Marin. The walls were lined with shelves of legal books, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. It wasn't a luxurious setting, but it was one that made her feel like she was about to take control. Control of the situation, of her future, everything that had been slowly slipping through her fingers. The betrayal wasn't just emotional anymore. It was financial. It was calculated. And it was time to fight back. Marin greeted her with a professional smile, though his eyes were quick to flicker with recognition of the urgency in her demeanor. He had seen his fair share of high-stakes cases, but nothing quite like this. Lyra's situation wasn't just about money, it was about everything she had trusted, everything she had believed in for years. And now it was all falling apart. "So, what's the latest?" Marin asked, leaning forward on his desk, his hands clasped together. Lyra didn't waste a second. She pulled out the stack of documents she had painstakingly gathered in the past few days. Fake invoices, doctored signatures, and the damning $200,000 transfer to an unknown account, proof of her husband's deceit. "This," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This is what he's been hiding from me. These are the fraudulent transactions. But there's more. There are threats, fake documents, and he's been planning this for months. Maybe longer." Marin flipped through the papers, his eyes narrowing as he studied each one. He nodded as he understood the gravity of the situation. "This isn't just financial fraud," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "This is a calculated attempt to strip you of your assets, your life. We can't just sit back and wait for him to make the next move." The words hit Lyra like a wave of cold water. She had known, deep down, that Callen's betrayal wasn't just about their marriage. He was playing a long game, and it wasn't one